Welcome to Essentials for Conducting Anti-Corruption Audits. Today's webinar. My name is Jim Kaplan. I'm president and founder of AuditNet.org, the global resource for auditors. This webinar is brought to you by CaseWare Analytics. I'd like to introduce our speakers for the webinar. Jennifer Ellison is a CFE and CISA. She's the Senior Legal Compliance Manager at Baker Hughes. Jennifer brings more than 17 years of experience to her role as Legal Compliance Manager for Baker Hughes. Her diverse background includes forensic audit, corporate investigations, ethics program management. Her experience also includes proactive fraud testing using data analytics, FCPA auditing, and risk assessment. Marianne Ibrahim is a Senior Counsel Audits and Investigations for Baker Hughes. Marianne leads selected anti-bribery and FCPA compliance efforts at Baker Hughes, including audits of foreign subsidiaries, joint ventures, and commercial sales representatives in high-risk and emerging markets, FCPA risk analysis, compliance due diligence on merger and acquisition targets. She also manages the Global Investigative Database and conducts compliance-related investigation. She assists the Chief Compliance Officer in the development, implementation, and monitoring of compliance efforts, including policy controls and communication matters. We're very pleased to have these two subject matter experts with us today. Before I turn the floor over to our speakers to introduce the agenda, I'd like to briefly cover the housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to that recording. We usually try to get that out within 24 hours, so look for that tomorrow before the weekend. The webinar recording link will be sent to the email address that you used for registration. Because we're operating under NASBA rules, we are required to ask polling questions during the webinar, and CPE certificates will be sent via email to those who answer all of the polling questions. If you're joining us from a tablet device or something, an iPhone or an iPad, you may not be able to respond to the polling questions, in which case just accumulate your answers into a single email and send them to myself, and I will make sure that they get recorded in our records. The CPE certificates and link to the recording will be sent to the email address you used to register. We're not responsible for delivery problems due to spam filters, attachment restrictions, or other controls in place for your email client. You do have the ability to ask questions during the webinar. You can submit questions via the chat box on your screen. We'll try to answer them during or at the conclusion of the webinar. Usually when we break for a polling question is usually a good time, and I'll ask for questions. If we see questions coming in, I will present them to our speakers. After the webinar is over, you'll also have an opportunity to provide feedback. Please complete the feedback questionnaire. The next slide shows you our disclaimer. I'm not going to read that, but basically it says that the views expressed by the presenters do not necessarily represent the views, positions, or opinions of AuditNet or the presenters' respective organizations. They may have additional disclaimers that they would like to explain to you, but for now, I'd like to turn the floor over to Jennifer to present the agenda and begin the presentation and give maximum amount of time to the information. Jennifer?
Thank you, James, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to introduce Marianne Ibrahim for just a moment, who is going to give a secondary disclaimer.
So we just want to reiterate the disclaimers that any opinions or any views that Jennifer and I discuss will not necessarily reflect the views of Baker Hughes and maybe our own personal views. Additionally, we cannot discuss issues of the merger, and we are employees of Baker Hughes, and everything we talk about relates only to Baker Hughes.
Thank you. So on our agenda today, we're going to talk very briefly about general FCPA and UK bribery acts. We're then going to talk about our FCPA audit program and our processes at Baker Hughes. And then we're going to speak a little bit about data analytics for FCPA audits. And we use FCPA a lot, but a lot of our slides are going to say anti-corruption. We're trying to change that to anti-corruption audits. So, and then we're going to have questions in the end. So feel free to ask questions along the way or save till the end, and we're most happy to answer those.
So I'll briefly run through this slide. It's widely understood and known that anti-corruption enforcement is increasing, not just in the U.S. but worldwide. And there are books and records provisions that are pretty much strict liability because no intent is really is required or will be analyzed in respect to books and records, and that there are also criminal and civil penalties involved. So you can move on to the next slide. What's the next slide? Okay, these are just some recent matters that have been and enforcement actions that have taken place with DOJ and SEC settlements, and obviously it's quite costly, and the branding and image costs obviously aren't included in these penalties, and so it's just not something a company obviously wants to endure. There are common DOJ settlement terms that address periodic review and testing for, with regards to audits and evaluation and effectiveness of programs and detecting violations of any corruption. The SEC and DOJ FCPA resource guide addresses periodical internal audits on page 59, and the UK Bribery Act also addresses in Principle 3 the importance of assessing and analyzing the internal and external risks of bribery on behalf of the organization, as well as monitoring and reviewing procedures and making improvements in Principle 6. So there's plenty of guidance on why your company should be doing or conducting anti-corruption audits. And if you need support to explain that to your board, just seek the guidance. Cool. So we conduct 4 different types of audits. The first is M&A due diligence review. So that's a pre-due diligence on potential acquisitions. And a lot of the concepts of the items that we identify and analyze overlap in these audits. So the next is M&A post-acquisition reviews. Once we acquire a company, we send in an audit team and review their procedures and compare them to our policies and procedures, as well as identify and evaluate some of the items. It's a complete audit program that we apply to that acquisition target, even though it's a newly acquired entity. The next is takes a lot more of our time, and it's our internal audits of our foreign subsidiaries and high risk and emerging markets. And our final type of audit we conduct is audit on our third parties. It's not all third parties, it's the highest risk third parties. So it involves our commercial sales representatives and our joint venture partners.
All right, and we're going to have our first polling question that Jim's going to put out there for you.
Okay, I've launched the first polling question. Please respond to the question, and then we will proceed. We do have one question that came in. Probably Marianne is best equipped to answer this. How do we enforce FCPA violations when most violations occur internationally in countries where such laws do not exist or are not enforced due to corrupt governments?
Sure. We get that question actually by our own employees. Well, it's not employees that have been with us long term. I think the Baker culture is so strong, and our compliance culture and training is so strong that our long-term employees get it. But new employees usually ask this, and that's a common question by people that haven't been immersed in the compliance world. And how I handle that when we're doing these audits abroad is I always look up local laws. Regardless if they're enforced or not, it is a law, and it is basic that a company must abide by that local law. So I tell people, okay, if you have trouble, usually these are local people, new employees, if you have trouble grasping, why the FCPA should apply to you, even though I've explained, to you that you yourself individually can have criminal penalties and jail time that the company cannot cover, putting all that aside, you yourself should be following your own local laws, and I list those local laws. So I encourage anyone that's going out to a certain country to look up those local laws beforehand and have that as a weapon, I guess. Okay.
Very good. Okay. Let me go ahead and close the poll and share the results. Okay. All of the above is the answer that was provided by the majority of our attendees. I assume that that is correct.
Yep.
Okay.
Excellent.
Very good. I'll go ahead and I will hide the poll and turn it back to you.
Okay. All right, so the next thing we want to talk about for a few minutes is audit planning. We begin our audits 4 to 6 weeks in advance so that we can coordinate with our local region and geomarket council. We can communicate with the leader of that geomarket or country to let them know we're going. We begin to request data. We review any type of previous audit reports that we have. It's typical of any type of internal audit planning. We review open and closed internal investigations, and we research current DOJ, SEC, UK Bribery Act enforcements, and we use the Sherman Sterling site for that. So we do the best we can to sort of take a look at the current activities in that region, and then we always coordinate with the locals, partially because we have to have permission to enter some of those countries, but partially because we want to make sure we do as much as we can up front, and that's similar to most any internal audit, of course, that we would conduct. So the next slide is performing the audit. So the basics of performing FCPA audits, FCPA and UK Bribery Act anti-corruption audits, is all about identifying points of government interaction and auditing those and performing interviews based around those points of government interaction. So this is something that one of my mentors taught me back in the early 2000s when I first started doing FCPA audits. It's all about government interaction, and that can be either direct or indirect. So an example of a direct government interaction is a payment of customs and duties straight to the Ministry of Commerce or straight to the government. Corporate taxes and penalties, Social Security payments, social insurance, visas and work permits. If we or your company directly train government-owned entities, no matter what they are, sometimes they're oil companies, sometimes it's energy and hospitals, and then the annual business licenses and permits. Then an example of an indirect payment is when we pay customs duties to an agent or a freight forwarder, or when we use visa processors to do our work permits and residency. If you use a commercial sales agent, no matter what you call them, an intermediary, a commercial sales agent, a trade sponsor, there's so many different names that companies use for these third-party intermediaries and sales agents. If you use distributors, I think someone called them a channel partner one time. So it's really important through your interviews to identify points of government interaction, and then to channel your auditing to those points of government interaction. And then Marianne's going to talk about interviewing for a few moments.
So our interviews are conducted by counsel. Auditors will attend certain interviews that they would like to participate in or have additional questions, or if they have a finding and want to address something directly or have me address it and listen to the response, they're always welcome. But we do try to have we do have compliance counsel lead those interviews. Sorry, and it's very important, obviously, in a multicultural setting to have someone that's open to diversity and open-minded and patient and culturally sensitive, and just using the wrong words or having the wrong attitude or dressing inappropriately will just offset the interview, and really it just won't be productive, and it's very costly, and so that's just something that's extremely important, because it just won't be worth the cost and the commitment that the company is putting forth if they don't engage sensitive compliance counsel to conduct those interviews. Let's see. Also, this is an audit focus. It's not an internal investigation. It's very easy to get down a trail or a certain line of questioning that can result in something that potentially could be a bribery issue or pretty huge, or can just be a completely different type of issue like a fraud issue that needs to be fully investigated. Well, instead of derailing the audit interview and going down the road, how we handle it is we just extract that issue and then we move on with our questioning with regards to the audit, because it's so important. We have so many questions for each interviewee, and they're very pointed and tailor specific to the roles that we have to get through those questions, and that's the priority. And then I set aside separate time to then move on to the investigative interview, which is conducted completely differently, has different disclaimers, etc. Okay, so selecting interviewees. These are the type of interviewees that we typically try to engage in and discuss. One item that's not on here because it's not really typical in our organization, but maybe in yours, is government relations individuals. I know some companies have those in each country or each business segment or whatever. If you do, obviously anyone that has any contact or potential contact with the government or SOEs, state-owned entities, then those must be on your interview list. Business development sales guys usually are working with our national oil companies or dealing sometimes with regulatory issues, etc. And so if that's the case, then they're always on our list. And the rest is pretty much self-explanatory.
Can I make a quick comment about the good working relationship we have with auditors? I think one of the things that makes our team work so well together is our constant communication and the great relationship we have. So my team, again, this is Jennifer, my team would be the internal audit, the compliance audit, and we are able to join some of the finance-related interviews, but we have a great communication to go back and forth. If we find something, we give it to legal. If legal hears something in an interview, they give it to us, and we constantly communicate during the entire audit.
It really, that is really essential for teamwork and effectiveness of an audit, for both groups to work together. Absolutely.
Okay, we're ready for polling question number 2, James.
Okay, polling question number 2 is up there. Please respond to the polling question. We'll leave that open for about a minute. Let me see if there are any additional questions that have come in. I don't see any. If anybody has any questions, please submit them. Jennifer, I know that you use IDEA.
Yes.
For your audits. Will you be demonstrating IDEA today, or is that just you're going to be discussing?
No, no, I'm not going to have a live presentation for IDEA today, but I have a lot of screenshots to show what our screens look like and the tools that we use.
Excellent.
Sorry about that. I do the live presentations during the Automation North America user group meetings every couple of years.
Right, every 2 years.
Yeah, in the live webinars, but.
And I think that should be coming up next year.
I think so. They just had a call for speakers for that, so
yeah.
We'll see.
All right, we've got 94% have voted. We'll leave it open for another 10 seconds, and other people are voting now, so we're going to go ahead and we will close the poll, share the results, and it looks like the majority said distributors with 60%.
Excellent.
Okay. Let me go ahead and hide that and turn the floor back to you.
All right. So now we're going to get into our audit program, which is probably why everyone's here, rather than us drooling on about the rest of FCPA. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the data request. We specifically request the trial balance, and we'd like this in electronic form, of course, not in PDF, but in some kind of data file format. the trial balance, the chart of accounts, journal entry line items for our period and for specific GL accounts, finance and compliance policies, audited financial statements, bank recs and statements, list of agents used by that area, and revenue by country. Obviously, we're going to get different response according to who we're auditing. We're not always going to be able to get this on a pre-acquisition due diligence M&A audit. We will get everything we ask for in a post-acquisition and everything we ask for when we audit our business units. We might get minimal information if we are upfront, if we're auditing an agent or intermediary or JV partner, but then we'll get it all the first day that we're there. So it's a little bit different, but we have a standard request, and this is generally the standard request we have for each audit that we perform. And then Marianne is going to go through our anti-corruption audit program for a few minutes. Let me go through the, do you want me to go through the GL accounts for a moment? Yeah, sorry. Here are the general GL accounts that we look at, and these should generally reflect your assessment of your government interaction, whether it's direct or indirect. So, of course, we want to look at any kind of commission payments that are made. We want to look at facilitating payments, which are not allowed, travel, meals, and entertainment, training, gifts, charity. I don't need to read the entire list, I think, but you get the picture that we are trying to look at every GL account that could possibly hold payments related to government interaction. And so it should definitely reflect the interviews and reflect your assessment of your points of government interaction.
So bank accounts and cash disbursement controls. With bank accounts, obviously this is a key area. You have to trace the money, right, and make sure you know what money's coming in and then where it's going out. How those accounts are being reconciled, making sure that those individuals responsible for the reconciliation have a segregation of duties to make sure their duties aren't overlapping and that they can potentially misstate something or not reconcile something correctly to cover their tracks. We're looking at offshore accounts, signatories. That's something very important because if you're in a big organization like ours, we have people moving around constantly and being promoted often. And so those signatories may not remain the same, so it's imperative to keep those signatories updated, and that's always a huge focus for us. And then, always checking to see if there's any offshore accounts, especially for our third parties. We want to know what type of business our third party is conducting, especially with regards to particularly with our accounts, and are they sending that money offshore? Why? What are they using that offshore account, et cetera? Cash funds. This is imperative. We've had a huge push in our company to eliminate and reduce our cash funds and our petty cash in particular. Obviously, there are certain countries that are just cash-based, and it's almost impossible to eliminate those funds there. But we have such strict controls around those funds, and we test and require strict adherence to those controls. So if there's any type of government payment from those accounts or any kind of unusual or suspicious activities, that's going to be a serious finding, probably a high-risk finding, and disciplinary action will probably ensue. So that's something to focus on. Your company may allow payments to governments or government, well, hopefully not government officials directly, but government entities from those accounts. Those should be highly scrutinized and tested and make sure all the supporting documentation is intact, and then those accounts are properly and regularly reconciled. With regard to travel and entertainment and gifts, huge area. You may find that there's nothing excessive in your audit. There's no crazy trips to Las Vegas or Disney World, or anything. No extreme outliers. But one thing to scrutinize is not just for suspicious outliers or types of expenses, but also for frequency of entertaining certain individuals, especially government individuals for the FCPA. If there is frequent entertainment, let's say 2 or 3 times a week, every week, the entire year, the Department of Justice is going to monitor that and look at that, and that's not going to pass muster. So also identify as an auditor those types of frequent transactions, and that should be a finding. Obviously, to identify any type of accounts associated with gifts. What are the gifts? Do they abide by your policies? Are they excessive? Are they frequent? How will they be viewed? Even though it's under $100, but it's they only paid, I don't know how, but $100 for this iPhone. Well, an iPhone itself may be viewed as excessive. So just talk with legal counsel and when you identify these things, and raise that as you identify them. Travel with government officials or national oil companies officials in our situation should be very highly scrutinized and limited, hopefully, by your policies and controls. So also raise those issues as well. Payroll. So this should be examined in light of potential ghost employees. I had a colleague, she told me of a recent finding at her company where they had, someone had left the company and they just continued paying them. So that's one form of the ghost employee, and they had continued paying them for, I think she said under a year, but still it was, it was several months after they had left the company, and that to us is a finding, and that's a potential weakness and control, and we would have reported it if it was a finding in one of our audits. Always request a payroll listing, test those listings, make sure those employees are active, and we always look at bonus payments and ask about those bonus payments. Are they warranted for the position? Are they too high? Why were they given? Were they given off-season when bonuses aren't usually given, etc. Okay. That's me as well. Donations and contributions. Hopefully your organization is not giving any political contributions, but check your third party and ask them. Sometimes they may be offended, but still you have the right to ask. They may not answer it, but most of the time in our case they will answer. Why are they giving political donations, and to whom, and can you test those payments? Charitable contributions, here's an example. We found one of our Middle Eastern agents, we saw a word called zakat, Z-A-K-A-T, and we had no idea what it is. Obviously, if you see something you don't know, please look it up, and we found out that it meant it's an Islamic charity donation. And so obviously we asked for those records, and we were closely scrutinized all of those payments, and thankfully our third-party agent was willing to cooperate with us on that. And there's other words for different types of donations, local donations, so make sure you have a translator with you, or you're researching this ahead of time before you go in country. Training, what type of training are you giving? Are you giving it to government entities or state-owned entity officials, and why? And is it tailored to what is necessary? Is it excessive? Do they have cigars and steaks and fancy wine afterwards and call it a training? Is it truly a training? You have to make sure to ask all those questions and test around that. Payments under local laws. This gets really tricky, and this is where it's very important to understand your business segments. An example we have is one of our business segments is our wireline entity, which deals with explosives and radioactives. And a lot of times in that entity, it requires local police escort, local licensing, specific handling, permits, import licensing, bunker controls, etc. And all of that is exposure to government entities. So we closely scrutinize that product line and business segment and test all the payments surrounding that entity. Let's see, obviously customs authorities and licensing, any type of licensing should be tested. Payments made to third parties. And this isn't just our high-risk third parties, which are commercial sales representatives or distributors, but other third parties as well, your professional agents, those types of payments should also be tested. And I'm going to pass it now to polling question.
Yeah, we're going to do polling question number 3 now.
Okay, before we launch the polling questions, we've got a couple of questions that have come in. One of them, I think now would be a good time to discuss that, and that's on facilitation payments. Robin wants to know, is it true that the FCPA does not allow facilitation payments? My understanding is that they are allowed as long as they are recorded correctly in the books and records of the U.S. company.
Okay, so I'll answer this one. The FCPA itself doesn't prohibit facilitating payments. And yes, of course, they should be recorded accurately. However, the Department of Justice will still scrutinize those payments, and they can determine whether or not it's a true facilitation payment or it's really a cover for a bribe, especially if those facilitation payments are made often or are odd in nature or have some peculiar characteristic to them. So it's going to be the DOJ's subjective interpretation of that payment. So I'm happy to work for a company that absolutely prohibits facilitation payments, and hopefully your company does as well, or takes the lead in that, because I don't think you want to be arguing in front of the DOJ whether or not this is really a facilitating payment or whether it's a bribe. Now, the UK Bribery Act does prohibit those. So if your operations at all, are subject to the jurisdiction of the UK Bribery Act, then that will be, absolutely prohibited.
Very good. Okay, let me launch the third polling question. In the meantime, I believe I forwarded some chat messages, which are other questions that have come in to both you and Marianne. So if you take a look at your chat, maybe you can see which of those questions you'd like to address. At this point, let me go ahead and launch the third polling question. Okay, and this one is, what types of electronic data would you request prior to your audit plan? So go ahead and vote. We've got a question here that came in from Mark. Where do the fines and penalties collected go when a company has been convicted for violations of FCPA and pays a civil penalty? Why aren't the company's senior executives charged criminally and go to jail, those who sanction such actions? Wow, that's a tough one.
So I'll answer the second part of that question. There have been senior executives that have been charged, and the DOJ, and that trend is increasing. Historically, that hasn't been common, but that trend is recently increasing. The first part of the question, I'm not sure I understand. Where does the money go of the penalties? DOJ and SEC assesses those penalties, so it goes back to the government. We know that the DOJ and SEC has heavily hired and increased their staff to hire more skilled and trained individuals from industry, from a variety of different sectors, and are more heavily staffed than in the past. So perhaps it's going there, but otherwise I can't speak on behalf of the government.
Let me go ahead and close the polling question now. We've got about 92% have voted, so register your votes very quickly if you're looking for CPE. We'll keep it open for another 5 seconds or so. Get those last minute votes in. And again, you don't have to answer this correctly, but you do have to answer. You do have to respond to the polling question. So we will go ahead and we will close the poll now. And we will share the results. And it looks like the majority said all of the above. Okay. And that is correct. Okay, let me go ahead and hide that question and turn it back to you, Jennifer and Marianne.
All right, so we're going to get into some of the data analysis now in the executing anti-corruption audits using a risk-based approach. My approach for doing fraud and FCPA auditing is that I want to identify journal entries or transactions or personnel that have multiple risk factors. So what I do is gather as much data as possible, download GL line items, expense reports, credit card transactions, things like that. I create separate data files for each test, anywhere from 5 to 15 tests. I want to link them together, and then I want to identify which journal entries hit most of those tests. Not most, but the largest number of those tests. So, and then I'm going to focus on those that have the most risk factors because they came up during most of those tests. So for an example, here are some examples of the tests that we would perform. And again, you'll notice a lot of these you can use for fraud testing, not just for anti-corruption. First of all, manual payments. Anytime you have business in a country where a check was written, instead of going through your typical electronic payment system, you can work with accounting to identify those in your company. We use SAP. Sometimes it'll be a specific document type. Sometimes it might be a specific posting key. There might be a specific payment block or payment type. So it's kind of up to you to identify that in your own company. But that's always important for us to look at anything that was stopped in a check that was written manually. We want to take a look at duplicates. That's pretty typical for the audit universe. Round dollar or round currency payment invoices, that may be less important in some countries that have currencies that don't use pennies and where everything is a round dollar. Some of those might be Equatorial Guinea and Vietnam, where the currency is a lot different than it is in the U.S. We want to look at compliance-sensitive words and compliance-sensitive accounts, and we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. We want to specifically look at what we term credit, cash, debit, expense, where someone bypasses the vendor accounts payable, where they just do a journal entry that credits cash, debits an expense. Because what should really happen is that you also, as part of the journal entry, use an accounts payable account, and that kind of bypasses that. So we want to look at those. Sequential invoices, that's typically a fraud type of a test, but it can also be an indicator of a much smaller vendor that perhaps a bigger company might, where we're their only customer. We want to look at prohibited vendors, so there are lots of tools that we can use, and you can also consult trade compliance and a sanctions attorney at your own company to take a look at vendors that might be prohibited. Their use might be prohibited by the U.S. government. We take a look at authorization limits. Again, this is something that you do most likely in every audit, where you want to look at transactions that are right at $2,450, $2,400, $2,450 if their transaction limit is right at $2,500. And then offshore bank accounts. And we're going to take a look at identifying offshore bank accounts today, compliance-sensitive words and accounts, and we're going to look at manual payments, I believe, too. So that's what we're going to do next. So this is a little bit of an ugly slide, but if you're an IDEA user, you might recognize it. I'm going to just walk through it for a moment because it reflects what I want my transactions and what I want my testing to look like when I'm done. So number one, on the left side of the slide, I have the list of the tests that I've run. So if you see number one on the left, it'll say, let's say my first test was split invoices. Test B was disbursements below the approval limit. Test C was duplicate disbursements. I actually create a field in IDEA. It's the last field. It's called test. And I put the name of the test in that field, just a regular text field that I can add. I append all those together and summarize them, as you can see in one. So on number two, if I summarize all the tests based on journal ID, I'll see on number two, close to the right, you'll see a journal entry number. And for instance, the first journal entry number hit 7 of my tests. Of course, this is demo data, So when I created the data, I wanted to make sure that I had some high ones. I had to sort of manipulate it to make sure I had good test results for this webinar. So as an example, again, you've got 3 journal entries that hit 7 tests. And in IDEA, I want to be able to click that 6 or 7, as I've highlighted. And then when I click that number 6, it's going to go back and show me all the line items. So for number 3 that's in the middle, I've clicked number 6. I'm sorry, about the 6th line item is highlighted. And when I pull it up showing the summarization, it shows me that it hit the split invoice test, it hit the duplicate disbursement test, it hit 3 compliance-sensitive words, and it's also a payment that's booked to a compliance-sensitive account. And those compliance-sensitive accounts are going to be all of those general ledger accounts that we spoke about earlier, such as customs and facilitating payments and travel and licenses and things like that. So I guess my point on this slide is to begin with the end in mind, as the Franklin Covey guy says, is that if you start your testing off thinking about what you want your end product to be, it will be a lot easier. So, and then the number one thing I do, again, is that I create a new column in IDEA called test, so that when I pen these and summarize these, I will be able to see every test that my transaction hit. Again, we're using demo data for all this, and none of the data that I'm using reflects any accounts in Baker Hughes.
Jennifer?
Yes.
We've got a question here. Please elaborate on compliance-sensitive words and accounts.
Certainly. I'm going to do that right now because I'm going to go to the next slide. Do you mind if I do that and go through those?
Sure. And then another question came in. How do you identify payments made to offshore accounts from your payment data?
We're going to do that as well.
Okay, perfect.
Sorry, those are great questions. I'm
Okay.
glad we're all on the same page, that those are the most, a lot of people ask those types of questions.
Good.
I'm going to switch to, let me go through this slide, and I promise I'm going to answer those questions. This is a slide that shows how we might analyze the chart of accounts. What I do is I use a multi-state field. So on the bottom of the page, you'll see that I have imported my GL accounts into IDEA. The first column is the account and the name. The second column is total. The third column is the general category of the GL account. And then I create a multi-state field so that my team and I can go through each of these accounts and identify which ones we think are appropriate. So in my multi-state field, I use a -1 in the parameter, and that means that the multi-state field will be blank. If I click it once, it'll be a check mark. If I click it again, it'll be an X. If I click it again, it'll be a question mark, and then it will move back to a blank. So my team and I can go through and sort of identify and mark which GL accounts we want to identify as compliance-sensitive GL accounts. You'll see here we have commissions, discounts, third-party cost of goods sold, things like that. We definitely want to identify commissions as a high-risk account. Here's our compliance-sensitive word search. So you can use the looping search that's available. It's pretty cheap on the automation site. And what the looping search will do is go through and create a, let me make sure I have the right one. If you have a list of compliance-sensitive words, I'm sorry, I'm happy to provide that to you. My slide doesn't have it on here. If you have a list of compliance-sensitive words such as travel, advance, custom, license, commission, things like that, permit, you can use the looping search that you can purchase from automation, and you can import. It's a macro that you can buy. You can import your word list from Excel, run it against a field, a text field in your IDEA document that you identify, and then this is an example of the result that it gives you. So it's going to show me any journal entry shown by the primary key is the journal ID, and it's going to show all of the journal entries in the text that included a word on my compliance-sensitive word list. So for instance, in this case, I had travel, and we have advance on there as well, so all the travel advances came up. I had the word permit, so you'll see on the right-hand side for document detail text, we had permit fees, rig site permits, things like that. Unfortunately, the term offshore is not such a good word for oil and gas company. You'll get so many hits on that. But I also encourage you to truncate the words as much as you can, because, for instance, you might have a word like commission. You might have, let's say, facilitating. Some people say facilitating, some people say facilitation. So just use facilitate. Travel, and there are also a lot of other good examples of truncating words as much as possible so that you can include. So this is a good example of a compliance-sensitive word search that we have using the looping search that's available from Automation. It's pretty cheap. I think it's only about 50 bucks or so. I'm not sure, though. The next one that we have is the word list maker. And this one is it's pretty great. Instead of doing a instead of your giving IDEA a list of your compliance-sensitive words, Automation's developed a macro that will go through your text fields and will identify all the words that are used the most in the text fields in your journal entry. So for instance, again, this is demo data, but we used it to compile a word list based on the reference and the text. The reference and the text in our those fields, and it came up with words like Nigeria, limited, international, DHL, custom, duty, visa, things like that. So you can go through yourself and take a look at words that might be used in the area that you're auditing, which you might not know about. So there are a few words that come up every once in a while. I think one of them was on an E&Y study that I saw last year, where people in a certain country were saying, "Where's my pie?" And the word pie was coming up a lot. I think Marianne had a note that they would use the word tea in certain places. So
tea, discount, promotion, a lot of that can be used as a facade for bribe or facilitating payment.
They all have special words they kind of use. So it's pretty important.
It's very cultural specific too, and country specific and language specific. We were in Malaysia, and we actually asked outside counsel to put together a list, and she came up with all these words we would have never searched for, and so that was helpful. Also, I saw a note that AuditNet has a list of more than 4,000 keywords. That's great. And then Forbes actually has a great article on bribery jargon. And so you could look that up. You can just Google Forbes bribery jargon to help you create your word list.
Yeah, the Forbes article lists about 30 words or phrases, and it does translate some of them into foreign languages as well. The list that we developed through AuditNet has 4,000 words, and we developed that based on input from a survey that we did. And we also had somebody in Holland, in the Netherlands, that actually translated those keywords into Dutch, and we're working on other translations as well. The question that I have is, in terms of the compliance-sensitive words and the word list maker, does that look at unstructured data, or is it just general ledger financial data?
I don't think that, well, it's got to be in a data format. So if unstructured data is more like emails and documents and things like that,
right,
then I don't think it's used for that.
Okay.
It has to be in a database type of format, in a field, in one of your text fields in a database format.
Okay.
This seems to be a lot more modern way to do things, and I've seen people do it through SQL commands, and it can be a bit arduous, but the word list maker makes it pretty easy.
Okay.
It runs pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think that was demonstrated during a webinar that we did last December. It's a very powerful tool. Great.
Let me keep going. Here are the manual entries. This is an example of SAP. Here are the T codes that I use to look at this. So you can use FBL1N for vendor line items. You can use 3N and 5N for GL line items, customer line items. I use tables BSAK for vendor payments. And for instance, again, you can your manual payments might be shown as a document type, a posting key, payment method, payment block. And I just got one example out of a table. It's a standard table, BSAK. It has vendor line items, payments, and invoices. For PM, that's called payment method. And your payment methods are going to be different. They're different in every country. And then PBK is payment block. It's also a standard field. So that's kind of an example of what you might want to look at. You might want to extract all of the vendors or all of the payments that have a payment block A or B. Maybe that means manual. E might be electronic. C might be check. So you might just work with accounting to determine how to identify those payments, those manual payments. We really scrutinize manual payments. Anything that was stopped and paid specifically, anytime a check has to be written to a government official, because that's just sort of the way it is in some countries, we really scrutinize anything that's stopped and paid manually, as I'm sure any audit, financial audit and operation audit would as well. Here are the vendor bank accounts. So here's the answer to the question for offshore. And I, again, am going to use SAP demo data as a specific example. The SAP tables for vendors are LFA1 is the vendor master. LFBK is the vendor master bank account table. So let's say if I'm doing an audit in Australia, which is the AU, I might download all of the vendors and take a look at the country for the Australia GM market or for whatever region I'm in. And then I take those vendors and I use table LFBK to show all of their bank account information. And I compare the country of the vendor to the country of the bank account. So in the middle of middle right, the lower right of the slide, you'll see on the left, it'll say table LFA1, that's the country of the bank account, with the arrows over to the right, which is table LFBK. And I'm pointing out specifically, again, this is demo data. The first arrow shows that the country is Australia for the vendor, but the bank country is CH, and that's Switzerland. Those are always interesting ones to look at anytime you see an offshore or Swiss bank account. And then the second one is an Australian vendor, and the bank account's in PG as Papua New Guinea. So that is the way that I identify offshore or any time where the vendor country is not equal to bank country. It's up to you to read and understand, as well as it's up to me to do that as well, to understand your company's policy on offshore bank accounts. They're different in every country, so you kind of have to ask yourself, is it allowable in your country, and are there reasons, are there acceptable reasons for offshore bank accounts? We also take a look sometimes with vendors with no bank account. So how are they being paid, basically? If we're making payments and they have no account, does that mean they're all cash? Does that mean they're checks? Things like that. So that's my answer to the offshore bank accounts. So these are all types of, 4 or 5 examples of the types of individual tests that we would run. The types of individual tests that we would run. And then, again, we would combine, let's say after I finished this, I would have 5 or 6 different data files. I would append them together and summarize them so I could perhaps come up with some transactions that hit a compliance-sensitive word and a compliance-sensitive account. Those two are similar, but they also had an offshore bank account and they were also a manual payment. Those are the types of things that you really want to spend your time focusing on the high-risk transactions. I always say it's against my religion to do random sampling because I didn't come from a SOX or an external audit background. So I'm all about data analysis and spending my time on high-risk transactions. I think this sort of comes to the end of our presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Marianne to talk about closing and reporting in a second, and then we'll be happy to answer more questions if you have them.
Before we get into that, Marianne, sorry about that. We just have one question, a general question in terms of IDEA. How many records can IDEA contain in a single data table?
IDEA is unlimited. It's only limited to the storage you have available on your hard drive. That's what makes it so much better than Excel and Access.
Okay.
It's unlimited. I've used in the millions and millions of records to do manual journal entry testing at year end. I mean, up to 2 or 3, up to 20 to 30 million records I've used before, but it's unlimited.
Okay, and then before we get to that final section, Bob asked, what if a foreign country location you're auditing is smart enough to know what the red flag bribery jargon words or phrases are and camouflage or label those accounts or journal entry description as something else? How would
So we
data...
do a couple of things. First of all, we target specific general ledger accounts, but we also ask to see bank statements, and we take a sample out of bank statements, no matter what GL account they're in. So, I mean, there's only so much you can do if someone's going to go out of their way to try to hide something. But not only do we select specific GL accounts, we want to see their bank statements, and we take samples from the bank statement as well.
Also, in response to that question, we don't just, but those aren't the only terms we focus on. There's so much other testing going on. Meanwhile, that if our auditors are pretty savvy and experienced, and if they just see anything that's just out of the ordinary, or a payment in a field that's just an outlier, or you know, terminology they haven't really seen before, things like that helps prompt them to search further and dig down further. Yeah, so it's a great question, and our stance isn't, you know, we solely rely on our list and are limited to our list. We're constantly asking questions, and this is where legal interviews help. Several interviewees will mention something, and something I haven't heard of before, or mention, you know, report on someone else doing something, and those words then get passed on to auditors to examine.
Excellent. Okay.
Okay, so closing and reporting. So this is our last slide. Well, there's one more just for useful resources, but this is pretty much the end. So key takeaway is there is constant back and forth communication with legal and audit. These audits are exhausting, but, you know, sort of exciting. For me, it's like when I was a litigator, and it's like preparing for trial and you're in the middle of trial work. It's just constant communication over lunch, dinners, breakfast. We're communicating our findings and our concerns, and any kind of things that we're seeing that come up that are, you know, repeated types of transactions or issues that seem like outliers or something peculiar. So just constant communication. Next is management communication. We involve our managers. We involve them in findings as we go, so that they can be a part of it and have ownership and help us, you know, get supporting documentation or emails or whatever to help explain whatever we're trying to analyze. And then we have an on-site closing meeting with management, stakeholders, key finance personnel, and then the final report is a joint report drafted by both legal and audit.
The next slide that we have are just some useful resources. We won't go through them, but they're part of your handout. And then we left room at the end for questions, but we're kind of right at the end, so I'll turn it back to James to ask some more questions or to close the webinar.
Yeah, I don't see it.
Thank you so much for listening.
Well, thank you both, Marianne and Jennifer. You did a great job today and answered a lot of great questions and provided a lot of good information. If anybody has any additional questions that they think of after the fact, they can send them in to myself, J. Kaplan at auditnet.org, and I can forward them on to Marianne or Jennifer. I think that their contact information is also available. Somebody just asked how we get the slides. The slides are available as a download, and basically those there should be a link for handouts, and the handouts are available for you to access directly from the site. At this point, I wanted to thank both of you again for a great presentation. Also thank CaseWare Analytics for helping to put this together. I think this was a very useful webinar. You will be receiving a link to the recording. That link will come to you tomorrow. The CPE, if you've answered all the polling questions, you will receive a CPE certificate. Those will be sent out the middle of next week. I would imagine is when we can get to those. We have to review all of the records before we go ahead and send those out. So again, thanks to everybody for attending. Thanks for the great questions, and look forward to seeing you all again on a future webinar. Thanks, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.